Over the last 10 years as a student of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, I've seen an extremely high turnover rate. And I've lived in three different cities during that time, and I've seen over 1,000 people start and stop Ashtanga. And in this video, I'm going to be going over all those different reasons. And one of my teachers, Simon Borg Olivier, actually gathered data on this and concluded that over 99% of people that start Ashtanga stop Ashtanga within the year. And that is a terrible number, let me tell you guys, because of course, in anything fitness related, there's going to be a very high turnover rate. If you go to a typical gym, the memberships blow up every single New Year's with all these people who are going to lose all this weight and change their life. But we are going to start today's presentation not with the physical, but the spiritual problems of Ashtanga. And there is no inherent problems with the Ashtangian system. But most of the time, when people come into something as extreme as Ashtanga Yoga or yoga and the spiritual arts in general, they have a void within. And Ashtanga encompasses many different is like the perfect recipe for disaster for a lot of those aspects. Because when we look at the series of Ashtanga, it exists in a hierarchical system. And it's so hierarchical that there are people who believe that this set of sequences is owned by the Joyce family still, even though the sequences were just ripoffs from other systems by Krishnamacharya and others. We don't need to get into that here. But the act of having to progress pose by pose through a series of systems makes you feel like you are accomplishing something. But is the spiritual void filled when your hands can touch the ground, like behind me? Like some of these people's hands aren't touching the ground. And are you going to become happier by letting your hands touch the ground? And for people who are experienced or understand, of course not. Like the intellect, some of the more intuitive and understanding people in yoga understand that's not going to change anything. And hopefully you can get to that point. But a lot of people who start yoga because they hear how experienced people like you and I talk about yoga think that by progressing through the asanas, that the spiritual void within is going to be healed. And Ashtanga gives you a head rush. Let's just be honest here. It is a kind of deep form of energy work that you can do anywhere. That's one of my favorite parts of Ashtanga is that I could be in a hotel room, I could be at my job. I sometimes do Ashtanga in my work clothes if I can find 30 or 40 minutes just to get it going. And it creates a change in consciousness, a much better change in consciousness than maybe any other form of physical exercise I know. And so that inherently fills that void. So you come and you see that there's this system that you can progress in, that you can win in, that you can one day be great at. Because we have these advocates, we have, all the top Ashtangas, and they were like, I was 30 years old and I had never stretched in my life. And then when I studied under an authorized teacher, 3 years later, this is what I looked like. And this is fueled by that yoga high. But the problem is that this is catering to the Western ambitious mindset. And that's supposedly why, and this is going to be a controversial people for the Ashtanga lovers out there, that Joyce created the system as he did and didn't change it because he modified Krishnamacharya's system to suit Westerners more. Because the Krishnamacharyan system was very individualized for each person. And ambition, as you guys know, creates rajas in the mind. And in general, Ashtanga Yoga does too. And if we can kind of combine all this together, when we have a beginner, and especially if they're doing like a lead primary, if they're just doing like lead primary or just doing it on their own, most of the time they are overstretching because the yoga high, the Ashtanga high, the change in consciousness that we all love, in my opinion, is actually a negative thing. It's actually creating a flight or fight reaction within the nervous system. And if you watch how people aggressively do it so that they can get to the next level, to feel more, to have more, and all these different things, then it is a negative thing because once that high is over, then they are thrown into their life. And once you've taken a drug, if you wake and bake at 4 a.m. with some Ashtanga yoga or weed, the rest of your day may feel better. But in general, you're not going to have the energy, the focus, the clarity, or any of these other things to solve some of those inherent problems within, because most of the time that's the real issue. And I've seen so many people who, after a while, after they get out of that honeymoon phase, they can no longer get their fix from Ashtanga and then they leave. And we'll get back to the spiritual in a second, but obviously the physical side. In general, There are bodies out there that aren't suited for Ashtanga. And if they are, doing Ashtanga really isn't the best way to get to that end point. So let's talk about the different aspects of Ashtanga. We could break it down to flexibility, strength, and like the spiritual component. So when it comes to flexibility, Ashtanga, I would say, depending on how you do it, is average to below average in terms of gaining flexibility. Like now in 2023, we have a ton of systems for gaining flexibility. And Ashtanga is good. It has a lot of flows, but a lot of it is very passive stretching. And there really isn't like, especially if we're just looking at the primary series, there's a lot of imbalances in terms of even within the passive stretching zone, but there also is little to no strength work other than, lifting the leg in Utthita Hasta Padangustasana. And then if you're doing drop backs at the end. And there are a couple others, and obviously there's jump backs and all of that. But there's a whole other realm. We're talking about flexibility that builds. There's passive flexibility, and then there's like active flexibility. And the Ashtanga system in general doesn't really build that. And so, if we're looking at an absolute beginner, and if they followed the system, like starting with, just the standing series and going through like a Mysore program, or even just doing lead primary, it's going to take them a pretty long time to get to the level where they are proficient, especially if they're older. If they're younger, if you're under 25 or even under 30 or 40, if you're healthy, then you should be able to make progressions if you're not too like broken or tight. But in general, for most of those people, I would recommend a whole other set of poses and ideas to get into Ashtanga yoga. But then what's the point? And so that creates a lot of injuries with people. A lot of people can't handle it, they get frustrated, and that's why they leave. Another one of the big components is obviously the strength component, and it's not as big in Ashtanga yoga. But I know people who've become so frustrated without being able to, as we're watching behind me, to be able to do jump throughs and jump backs that they also quit Ashtanga yoga. And if you look at this strength aspect of Ashtanga yoga, it's almost at the bottom because there's little to none. There is some preparatory handstand stuff if you want to do handstands, and most authorized teachers won't allow that. But other than that, there's no leg strength work, there's no pulling strength, there's no contralateral strength or flexibility, and the pushing strength is actually very one-dimensional. There's also no like hip hinging strength going on either. So it's an absolute disaster when it comes to strength training. And if you have little to no strength training and passive flexibility, a lot of problems are going to happen. And there are people who can make it through. And most of the time, we are the 1%. Sometimes people can make it through without doing any of those things. And we think it's because people are quitting. But most of the time, it's because the system is broken. And the only people who make it through are the people who bodies can just adapt to it and they're young enough or whatever to make it through, or people are dealing with pain or going through problems. I hear about it all the time. And I know now, after training in many different modalities, that you can get flexible, as strong and flexible as you want with little to no injuries. During my peak of Ashtanga yoga and conquering the intermediate series, I had a lot of pain and I was doing things pretty right. I mean, getting up, I was kind of warming up in the morning, doing some light movement, taking a hot bath, like making sure my body was feeling pretty loose before going in and practicing at 5:30 in the morning. I had an authorized teacher that wasn't too pushy or too cranky with the adjustments, but I was still dealing with these little things because if you want to progress, if you want to do these things at a moderate pace, I feel like the injuries and the little tweaks are almost unavoidable in Ashtanga. And once again, that could be my own problem. Maybe if I took things really slow over the course of 5 years, I could, have mastered it without any of those tweaks. But that's a pretty long time to have to go like only 20%. Because when you're doing something, you want to go pretty hard, right? I mean, you don't need to go hard, but you want to be able to feel like you're putting an effort in. And most of the time, if I'm practicing Ashtanga 6 days a week and going pretty hard, a lot of the tweaks start to happen. And as someone who has the time and the knowledge of anatomy and of recovery, I could get over a lot of those injuries. A lot, I back in the day, I'd be taking ice baths, I'd be rolling out with massage balls and like doing visualization and like whatever I could to like minimize some of those injuries. But once again, it seems dumb, and a lot of people are just going to be turned off by that. And one of the other main things I think that and this is a positive for Ashtanga. I don't know any other asana system that prepares you better for pranayama and meditation other than Ashtanga. Because, classically you do some asana, then you do pranayama, and then all of that opens you up for a great meditative practice. And I agree. That's the reason I'm still here. That's the reason I keep an Ashtanga system in my life. at some level and like continue to maintain it. Because if I do even just 45 minutes or a 60-minute sequence that's modified, that's, of Ashtanga stuff, I feel very open for meditation. But if I go do some mobility, contortionism stuff, I don't feel that way. I just kind of feel like I'm a little bit warmed up. I get a little bit of that, but it's honestly not there. But how often do you hear that talked about? Sharath Joyce and Patabi Joyce and most authorized teachers, they are not having everyone do pranayama and meditation and teaching the different principles of yogic meditation because they don't care. Let's be honest, that's not one of the main selling points. Meditation, pranayama, those things don't make money. Those don't bring the students in the door. And that those also create self-revelation. And most of the time, as I have been discussing, from what I have seen, the students that stick through it, the 99, the 1% that keep going, there's probably 50% of those people who are not really into the whole spiritual or personal growth aspects of Ashtanga and yoga in general, if not higher. I mean, that is a very generous 50%. It's probably more like 90% of people who are actually continuing a serious yoga practice in terms of Ashtanga Vinyasa yoga, whatever the hell, are actually dedicating time and space to the actual things that build higher consciousness, because all asana does and a good Ashtanga practice does is prepare you for those practices of raising into higher consciousness. Yes, you can understand like subtle body awareness and some of these things, but other than that, it all means nothing. And so it seems like the traditional system is dying, and I know it is. And if we want to keep the traditional idea of Mysore and Ashtanga yoga alive, then I think we need to repackage the whole messaging. We need to tell people up front about the problems. We need to drop all the guru stuff, all the worshiping, and we need to cut right to this is the system, get people into the pranayama, into the meditation immediately. Tell them that that is the purpose of this. The purpose of this isn't to be ambitious and put the foot behind your head. And that it may look like that will get less people in the door, but most people who are coming into Ashtanga are leaving Ashtanga. And I guess I should talk about some of that right now because you guys may not see this, but like I said, when you look at it over the course of years, like people who just are continuously practicing over the course of years, it's very rare. And I was inspired to do this video because the other day I'd gone to a conversation with this couple and they told me that they were like very into Ashtanga and they were in their 20s. And I was looking at him and the guy was like a big guy. He was like 200 something pounds and the girl was kind of chubby too. And you can be chubby and do Ashtanga, but they were like yoked. And then I was like, whoa, I was like, do you guys still do Ashtanga? They're like, sometimes, but we do weightlifting now. We're like really into weightlifting and like trying to get stronger and like doing all this and we feel much better. And I was like, maybe these people really weren't into Ashtanga at all. And then I looked at their like profile. We added each other on Instagram and I scrolled down and they were close to finishing half intermediate, like proficiently with an authorized teacher. Like they had a very strong practice going on and like a lot going for them. And they had the Ashtanga body and were living the lifestyle. And they basically told me it was hurting them, that they felt like they were weak and that they started weightlifting and they realized that they were missing out on this whole different aspect, that like you can have flexibility. You can be a gymnast and be as flexible as any of these people right here, but be strong as hell too and be big and like all these different things. And they're like now trying to find that balance. And like that's what a lot of people end up doing if they keep going down this journey. They realize that this is not enough. And the messaging is wrong because a lot of the people who are telling us to continue Ashtanga are making money from Ashtanga. A lot of these people are teachers. A lot of the Instagram stars are obviously making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year or making their livelihood from Ashtanga. So they can't just sit here and say, because it's hard to pivot. If you want to pivot and start saying, hey, I'm this level 1 authorized teacher, first of all, you might get that accreditation taken away. But if you want to add something, for instance, like kettlebells, right now I'm training for the Strong First kettlebell certification. And it is hard. As someone who has been doing a lot of flexibility work and body weight work, having to pass this test the requirements are very hard. And it has like a 70% failure rate. You have to do some like pretty crazy things to pass this test. And so if I, as a yoga teacher, I want to have the same accreditation that I've had, teaching yoga for over a decade now, then I need something big. But to get a real certification, to actually be able to show something, if you get this kettlebell certification, you actually have to be strong. You have to do some pretty hard stuff to pass the test. So I'm going to have to spend a bunch of time to be able to give people the other option because I've been so one sided the entire time. And I think that, figuring out those things from the start would be much better because the community has moved toward that now. They're like, hey, do pull ups. We need to get our pulling strength. Do some pull ups and do some squats every once in a while. But once again, that's not enough. And judging from how the Joyce family is running their huge marketing scheme, we're never going to see that happen coming from the top. And that's the only way Ashtanga Vinyasa will change because there's this whole group of followers. And if they were told to do pull ups, to do these things, they would do it. But that would mean that they would have to admit that the system was wrong. The system isn't yoga therapy, isn't a nerve cleansing, isn't all of these things. And that I don't think is going to happen. And that's why I think the Ashtanga turnover rate will continue to be high and it may even get higher because of all the cool new modalities of stretching and flexibility or of strength training that are out there now.